This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, I will be speaking with philosopher Lenn Goodman about time and religion, and the conversation will begin in a moment. This is my third entry in my trilogy on time and the nature of time. Lenn Goodman is the philosopher I'm speaking to. We will be speaking about time in the religious sense, how time relates to the divine, ideas about God, and things of that nature. As I usually like to do, I want to give my guests a few minutes to give a little bit of background about themselves, who they are, what they believe in, and anything they've written or contributed to the field. So welcome, Lenn, and if you could give a little bit of background information about yourself.
Thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here. Sure. I'm a philosophy professor here at Vanderbilt University. I do work in Jewish and Islamic philosophy. In Islamic philosophy, I'm an interpreter. In Jewish philosophy, I'm a player. And I'm interested in philosophy in all sorts of periods. I've written a number of books in this area. One of them is called God of Abraham. Another one is called On Justice, an essay in Jewish philosophy, which deals not only with justice between and among human beings, but also with the relationships with God that human beings have. I've written about Islamic ideas of time, and I'm sure we should talk about that in relation to these questions about time that you're interested in, Dan. And the range of my work in terms of the history of philosophy covers from everything from the ancients to contemporary debates. I don't consider myself an expert in all of them, but I certainly have an interest in all of them.
Well, let me just start off with the Old Testament. In both Judaism and Christianity, the idea is that there was no form, everything was void, and then God just sort of whipped everything together and it appeared. Is that the same beginning of the cosmos and the beginning of time that is described in the Quran?
Yes, the Quran is very much responsive to the Hebrew and Greek New Testament, the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Quran says God had only to say be, and it was, and that's a reflection of the very opening lines of the Hebrew Bible, where God says, "Let there be light." You get the summary passage that first there was nothing, and God created heaven and earth, which is meant to apply to everything. You said formless, and that's of course a reflection of the Hebrew, the famous Hebrew phrase "tohu vavohu." The Torah wants people to think about the world as they know it, and then imagine that none of this was there. And it doesn't use abstract words like nothingness, but it uses this image of something often translated as formless and void. It wants to give you the idea that if it hadn't been for God's act, nothing as we know it would have existed at all.
Yeah, one of the innate kind of contradictions with religion and science is, well, the idea that, for example, in the Old Testament, God is creating the universe and presumably time along with it, which suggests that God is somehow extra time. He's outside of time. It's outside of time. But since God is doing the act of creation, which is a series of steps, there must be some kind of super time that God lives in. So God must live, if not in mortal time, he must live in some kind of thing that resembles time. Is that one of the things that philosophers like you will talk about in relation to time and the divine?
Certainly they do, but to go back to the Hebrew Bible for a moment, that's not written by or for philosophers. It has philosophical ideas in it, and it has argumentation in it. And the argument, when it says in the beginning God created heaven and earth, is that nothing we know would have existed. The suggestion is that nothing at all would have existed. and that was debated by later interpreters, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, trying to understand that. On the one hand, we have Aristotelian philosophers who say that it's inconceivable that there would have been a first moment, because that would be a moment before which nothing happened, and the notion of before which already implies that there was time there. They're trying to prove that time is eternal, and to use that, as Aristotle does, to prove that motion is eternal, and if the motion is eternal, there must be things in motion, and so the world must be eternal. That's an Aristotelian argument, and when Jewish, Muslim, and Christian philosophers get to work on it, they regard that argument as fallacious. They say there's no reason why there couldn't have been a first moment of time, and that the notion of a time before time is specious. It was just an attempt by Aristotelian philosophers and Neoplatonic philosophers to sort of bootstrap themselves into a position of saying that time is eternal, motion is eternal, the world is eternal. They wanted to say that the world may depend upon God, but would have existed eternally anyway. And of course, the monotheistic scriptural response to that is, if you make the world eternal, you've made the world necessary, and you don't need God anymore. So the famous Muslim philosopher Al-Ghazali, who lived from 1058 to 1111, says, if you take that kind of position, that amounts to atheism. Other philosophers, both Muslim and Jewish, said not necessarily. You could believe in a kind of non-temporal dependence of the world upon God, as Ibn Tufayl said, subject to one of my books, or as Maimonides says, who's probably the most prominent Jewish philosopher. The question you raise about does God exist in some kind of a meta time or super time or something like that, it's a good question, all right, but it probably arises from the difficulties that we have in thinking of anything that's non-temporal. Maybe that's just an artifact of the kind of thinking that we do. You find an idea of that kind in the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who thinks that all human consciousness is temporal, and we know that to be true. But Kant recognizes very clearly that that doesn't imply that divine thought would be temporal. We can't really project from our own psychology onto what God's thinking would be like. You know the great line in poetry, Euclid alone has gazed on beauty bare. Beauty bare in that line would refer to beauty without spatio-temporal coordinates, and the pure abstract that you have in mathematics. One of the things we know about mathematics is that mathematical truths are timeless. And philosophers like Plato thought that divine life would be in a non-temporal realm. But I use the word realm metaphorically. God doesn't live in space any more than God lives in time. I mentioned Al-Ghazali already, and Al-Ghazali thinks that time is relative. That what's absolute is where God is. And again, I use the word "where" metaphorically. The notions of time and space, as Kant showed pretty exhaustively, are part of our way of being, not necessarily part of God's way of being. So you think you get the idea of God sort of precipitating the world into existence out of eternity. Imagine a computer. That's an easier way for our thinking to go. Imagine a computer which has a program in it, and think of that program as a bunch of algorithms which contain basically timeless mathematical truths. And then you start the computer running, and the computer performs procedures and operates those algorithms. That might be a good metaphor to think of what the relationship between divine life, divine consciousness, and human life and human consciousness would work.
Yeah, Len, let me ask about the difference between an agnostic and a religious view of time. I'm an agnostic, and if you look at science and you people who query about what time may be, sometimes they'll give a flip answer like, "Well, time is the thing that prevents everything from happening at once," and but it seems that time serves two different purposes within science and religion. In science, it seems that time is accepted as another sort of bit of the sort of mechanism of existence, that just like the three spatial dimensions, just like the cosmic laws, the cosmic forces, time exists. It's random, it's chaotic, it doesn't serve any higher purpose. In religion, it seems to me, religious thought views time as something that goes hand in hand with purpose, that with time we are to ameliorate in some way to get closer to the divine. Do you think that religion has imbued time with a purposiveness?
That's a beautiful question. Let me start with the agnostic end of it. Uh, Most medieval philosophers would have given their eye teeth if they could prove that time had a beginning. In order to prove that, they'd have to prove that motion had a beginning, and all the science of the day, which was basically Aristotelian, was running against them. They thought, we don't detect any variation in the motion of the heavens. The heavens seem to be that eternal clock that makes time itself everlasting. Nowadays, ever since the exponents of Fred Hoyle's view about steady state universe have been in pretty substantial retreat, we have a lot of evidence of the Big Bang. The main evidence for the Big Bang, and there's others, but the main evidence for the Big Bang, the impressive evidence, was the redshift. Astronomers look out into space and they see the spectral lines, which are signatures of the different elements and located at particular places on their spectrographs. Those spectral lines are shifted in the direction of the red. That's been explained in the last century as an effect of the receding of those distant objects. The further out they are, the further away they're moving from each other and from us, and that's evidence that they used to be closer together. And if you project that back, you get the idea of the Big Bang and an initial singularity. I don't know any medieval philosopher who wouldn't have been tremendously excited, and the scriptural monotheists among them would have been tremendously gratified. It doesn't prove that the world has a finite lifespan, has only existed for a finite length of time, but it's very, very strong evidence in that direction. And as you know, there are now evidences of echoes, if you will, of the Big Bang that we can detect, which confirm the notion that there was an initial event, which was an initial singularity. Now, there's nothing to prevent that expansion from going on for billions of years, and then somehow the universe might collapse again, and the whole process would be cyclical. But the smart money these days is on the idea that the universe did begin, And the reason my medieval philosophers would have been so excited about that idea is that that would have shown them, in that so-called initial singularity, that things don't just start by themselves. They must have needed something to start them, something that transcends the physical system. And they thought if they could show that the world had a beginning, it would be easy for them to show that it had a creator, a beginner, to get it started. Now, in that respect, the evidence these days supports a retreat for agnosticism, at least on that question. Now, the larger question that you raise is, I think, closer to the heart of biblical thinking. That is, we know that time seems to have a direction. It's not just that two events, can't happen at the same time. They've got to have some kind of sequence to them. That's what they call time's arrow. But introducing notions of value and indeed responsibility, as you suggested, that the directionality of time has a meaning, and it's a meaning to which we can and should respond responsibly, if you will. That's of course not an idea that comes from physics. It's an idea that's scriptural. You find it in the Bible. You find it in Old and New Testament, and of course in the Quran. And the reason is that the Bible, starting out with the idea of creation, has a view of history which is linear, not cyclical. It's not just the same events occurring over and over again, as Epicurus believed, or as Nietzsche in the 19th century believed. There's a directionality to time which works well with scriptural ideas of value and purpose, and that I can't say that the view of time implies the view of time as linear implies that there's purpose. But if you start thinking about history in relation to time, then you get ideas of progress, and you get ideas of responsibility, and you get ideas of, as you suggested, we need to do something to make our time, which really means to make our life and our activities meaningful in the sense of adding value, imparting something worthwhile. And that's an important idea of scriptural thinking. It's not there in all religions. Buddhism and Hinduism have different ideas about the relationship of values and time, but it's certainly central in Western ideas of not so much of the nature of time, but of what we do with it. The idea is we're situated here. One of the things that I think actually enhances that idea, which does come from science, is Darwinian thinking. A lot of people who are anti-religious have jumped on Darwin as their champion and as their poster child, because they think that Darwin did away with the idea of purpose. If you read Darwin, you find that the idea is central in Darwin's thinking, because what Darwin does in explaining evolution is to say organisms have needs, and there are better and more efficient and worse and less efficient ways of meeting those needs. The idea of teleology, which is very ancient in biology and in medicine, you think about your heart. Your cardiologist needs to know what your heart is supposed to be doing if he or she is to treat you. The idea of purpose is essential in biology. It's essential in medicine. It's essential in physiology. We know what an organ is doing and how it's functioning in behalf of the organism and in behalf of the lineage that the organism represents to sustain its kind and survive the changes and adapt to those changes. The Darwinian idea of adaptation is a teleological idea, and that gives some scientific support to the notion that there are purposes in life, and that we humans, who are capable of reflecting and evaluating on our situation, we humans can choose and adjust our purposes, and that, I think, is where the idea of our responsibility to make our lives meaningful in the flow of time.
Yeah.
The purpose doesn't come from time itself. It comes from our needs and our interactions and our responsibilities for ourselves and for one another.
Yeah, I think when you use teleology, and for people that know, that's sort of purpose based upon what something does. For example, a drone bee's purpose is to enhance, to do certain tasks to enhance the beehive, for example.
Right.
When people look to Darwin and say he doesn't talk about purpose, what they're meaning is some higher purpose, the will to create art or something that's beyond the physical needs. But you packed a lot of into that answer, and I wanted to just pick up on something you said early in that. You know,
Can I respond to that?
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Because it's a very good point. You're quite right.
Yeah.
Darwinian evolutionary science localizes purpose.
Yeah.
It doesn't propose a kind of overarching, divinely imposed or divinely inspired purpose, but that ethical kind of move that we make when we try to make our lives meaningful, in the sense that you were giving the term, that means that we're trying to figure out not only how we fit into nature, or how nature fits into our lives, but also how we can optimize our purposes. See, teleology in the human case reaches a kind of higher order plane because we not only have purposes like breathing and getting enough food and water and staying alive and finding mates and so forth. We also have the ability to adjust and adapt our purposes. We don't have to wait for the genes to do it for us. We can choose purposes, and to some extent, to a limited extent, but to some extent, we can sort of steer the boat that we're in, and that's where we look for ideas of transcendent purpose.
Yeah.
These are things that we have to discover. Some people think we have to invent them, but we're trying to connect with those purposes. So we see all these organisms trying to survive and procreate and so forth, and we think, what does that mean in terms of us? What purposes are we to serve?
Yeah, we've created meaning, and a fly or a lemur can't. But let me get back to early. Whenever I do these interviews, people sometimes ask, "Do I have a list of questions?" And I say, "No, I like to talk because things come up." And you brought up something that, if I had just following a list of questions, would not have come up in the interview. And I wanted to go back to the idea that you were talking about of possible multiverse and whatnot. I've done some shows on multiverses, and I actually did a show a couple of weekends ago with a couple of people who are in favor of polytheism. And I know when I spoke to the polytheists, they were very consonant with the idea of possible multiple universes fitting into their hierarchy of multiple gods or goddesses. And I'm just wondering if there comes some evidence, some strong evidence in the next century or two, that we do live in some kind of a multiverse, and there are a handful of major ideas about what that might be. But let's say one of them is proved to a 99+% certainty. I'm wondering, does that open the door to more ideas about time? Because time may run backwards, time may run sideways, time may run in directions we don't understand in that kind of universe. Causality may be something that's alien to that. Does that open up the idea that there would be more than one God, but also more than one time? And is a monotheistic religion sort of wedded to just one time and one God?
Lovely. I think the short answer is yes. I think a monotheistic religion is wedded to the idea of one time and one God. Although, as we said at the outset, God seems to transcend time, just as God transcends embodiment and space. But Aristotle has a nice argument against the notion of a multiverse, and I'm not sure if the argument works anymore. I'm not enough of a cosmologist to pronounce on that subject, but the argument that Aristotle uses is if there were multiple worlds, there's this question of how they would be connected or disconnected. It suggests that multiple worlds would either interact or fail to interact. I think that the kind of evidence that you're and the implied implication, the implied conclusion is if they interact, they really form one universe. If they don't interact, then you've got a kind of situation where there'd be some kind of rules or principles that connect and relate them. And again, you'd be back to one universe.
Yeah.
So that brings me to the question of what kind of evidence would count in support. Suppose we knew, as you say, 99+% certainty that we live in a multiverse. What kind of evidence would that be? It would be evidence that the physical laws we know don't apply there. That sounds to me, in my amateur standing as an amateur cosmologist, not at all a professional one, that sounds to me a little fishy. What kind of evidence would show us that that the laws of nature that we know don't apply in that other universe? It would have to be evidence that somehow connected it to our universe. Otherwise, we wouldn't know anything about it. And that suggests to me that we're still dealing with one universe, even though there might be, I put scare quotes around the word places now, even though there might be places where the laws we know work quite differently and have alternatives and so forth. That brings us back to one universe again. I think the notion of a multiverse is, in that respect, very suspicious, possibly incoherent, because, as I say, in order for us to have the scientific evidence that you're proposing, there would have to be some way in which that universe affected and was affected by the one we live in. There would have to be some kind of causal connection between the two. Now, you suggested two additional things. One was that in that other universe, time might run backwards. I guess everybody knows who reads Lewis Carroll seriously that in backwards land, everyone lives in a mirror and things run backwards, and it comes out very entertaining, but also, of course, quite incoherent. There are logical problems about the notion of time running backwards. We do know from Einstein's work that it's quite conceivable that time might be slower or faster, and that's relative to motion and gravitational fields and so forth. One of the interesting things about Einstein's work, I mentioned that Al-Ghazali was a time relativist. The original time relativist was Aristotle. He thought that time and place, as he put it, he didn't like to call about space because he thought that the notion of empty space was inconceivable, and I think he was wrong about that. But the notion that time and place are relative is a very interesting notion, and the modern scientific revolution debunked it. One of the great achievements of Newton was supposed to be to show that that time is absolute and that you can conceive of space in purely as a Cartesian grid, all laid out, and the lines of that grid, the measurement from, well, put it very simply, if you went a mile east and a mile west and a mile north and a mile south, you'd wind up exactly back where you started from. The lines of a grid, if you drew them, would be perfectly straight, and their angles would be perfectly rectilinear and so forth. With the notion of fields of force and with the notion that Einstein taught us about the relativity of time and space, we don't have to think that way anymore. And you can sort of score one for Al-Ghazali there, because he wants to think of God as transcending the natural world and transcending the natural order. And for God, causality doesn't work the same way it does for us. More intellectual, less physical, for one thing, which is what all the great Platonic philosophers thought. If there is a multiverse, you ask, would that support the idea of multiple gods? I don't think so. I think that now I'm taking the false hypothesis, the one that I'm suspicious of, and assuming for the moment that it's true. If there were a multiverse, would there be multiple gods? I think that question is based on a false idea of what God is. God is in the monotheistic tradition, and that's quite distinct from the polytheistic tradition. God is not supposed to be one guy who runs one show, whatever running a show turns out to mean. God is supposed to be the ultimate. And the notion of God is going to adjust as our knowledge grows, as our scientific understanding grows, as our moral understanding grows. If people think of God as capable of doing evil, then they're not really thinking of God in a monotheistic way. That's a point that Plato argues in several dialogues, especially in the Euthyphro, and it's also a point that the Bible, in its own way, argues when it shows Abraham being blessed by God for not sacrificing his son, something I wrote about in my book, God of Abraham. The idea that God has to be ultimate and therefore God could ask you anything, even to sacrifice your much beloved son, is a pagan intrusion into the logic of monotheism. And part of what the epiphany that's represented in the story of the binding of Isaac, and viewers can read about that in God of Abraham, a part of that epiphany is for Abraham to realize that the ultimate God is ultimate morally and not just causally, as he says when arguing in behalf of the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah, will not the judge of all the universe do justice? If God is ultimate, then God's got to be good. So our moral knowledge, just like our scientific knowledge, is going to contribute to our understanding of what God is. And if there were a multiverse, then God would be that being which, in some sense, presides over all of it. All those laws and patterns and processes would be deriving their worth and their being and their value. Being is one value from God. That's what monotheism means. And the polytheist who raised that question is raising an interesting question, but in a way that is begging the question, because he's inserting a polytheistic idea of God, as being, this is the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus, and if you want to go to a different circus, that's down the street. He's inserting a pagan idea of God into the question. presuming the answer to the question that he's raised.
Well, let me
failing to understand and failing to apply
Yeah.
what monotheisms really understand what they mean by God.
Well, I was raised as a Missouri Synod Lutheran, and I
Okay.
was taught that God was all-knowing, all present in all things, all good, all powerful. And I don't want to get off talking about whether an all-powerful God can be all good when we see the universe as it is. But it would seem to me that the notion of God as all-pervasive, all-powerful lends itself to the idea of not polytheism, but possibly pantheism. And if we're talking about a pantheistic God that permeates everything at all times, in all ways, in all powerful numbers, then time takes on a more personal aspect of God rather than being something God created. That time is somehow, it almost becomes like the Hindu idea that, I forget whether it's Shiva or whichever God has dreamt the universe, that time and the cosmos are something elemental within God rather than apart from it. Am I correct in assuming that if we assume an all-powerful, all everything God, that it's more of a pantheistic view, and time then becomes something subordinate or part of that God?
It gets tricky, doesn't it? I don't think I don't think there are any experts on God except maybe God himself. But pantheism can mean lots of different things to lots of different people. Sometimes Spinoza, who's a philosopher I think very highly of, is labeled or branded as a pantheist, and I think that's a very simple-minded reading of Spinoza, or just based on hearsay and not really reading him at all. One of the problems you get, there's only one group of philosophers I know who are really authentically pantheist. There were some tendencies like that in the American transcendentalist thinkers and the American transcendentalist painters, for that matter. But the real philosophers who worked out the logic of pantheism as best they could were the Stoics. And that was the dominant school of philosophy from about 300 BC for 300 years. And Stoic ethics survives to this day. So when we talk about concern and caring and responsibility, we're talking Stoicism. And it's a very lively and vital philosophy. But when you try and do what the Stoics did with pantheism and work out the implications of that kind of view, there's a risk you run, and the nature of the risk is a kind of ambiguity about whether you are divinizing nature or naturalizing God. And the Stoics kind of oscillate between those two extremes. There's something rather equivocal about their position, and it's I mentioned this historical epoch when Stoic philosophy was so dominant in philosophical people's thinking. I mentioned this as a caution to those who find ideas of pantheism attractive, because that experiment to some extent has been played, and we have some idea of where it leads and what the risks along the way might be. Two risks, and then a third one capping them. The risk of divinizing nature, right? So, every little thing is divine, versus the risk of naturalizing God, which means reducing God to all those little things. But the biggest risk of all, from a philosophical standpoint, is the risk of the equivocation, where you're trying to make the same word mean two incompatible things at the same time. I don't deny that there are strengths and attractive characteristics to pantheism, and certainly when you talk about the omnipresence of God, that's something that pantheistic philosophers are sensitive to, and rightly so. And some of the Eastern philosophers have explored those avenues very thoughtfully, and it's worth learning from them. But one of the things that you find if you read very very sensitive and thoughtful Hindu philosophy, you don't have Shiva and all that anymore. You don't have Ganesha. That's popular religion, and it has all the anthropological traits of popular religion, answering to various kind of emotional and social demands that people make. But if you read the really thoughtful Hindus and the really thoughtful Buddhists, they do tend to move in a monotheistic direction, and of course that means they're going to have all the problems that you're referring to, notions of. I'm good with the notion of divine perfection. Not everybody is. I have a friend, Yoram Chazoni, who is a prominent Israeli philosopher, who thinks that divine perfection is impossible, mainly because of the problem of evil. I'm fine with divine perfection, but where I'd have to agree with Chazoni and others is that doesn't mean that everything works out the way we would like it to work out. It doesn't mean that there is no problem of evil. I think the problem of evil is answerable, but you've still got to answer the Epicurean question about, okay, then why doesn't God fix things? And I think there are good answers to that. Otherwise, wouldn't be intellectually honest to believe in God. But the notion of omnipotence, turning God into some kind of a perpetrator of magic tricks, is a vulgar notion, and I think we should try to outgrow it. There's a wonderful line in a book by there's a Christian theologian by the name of Wolf, and Wolf has this wonderful line about athletes who sort of pray before going out on the field. He says, if God really influenced the outcome, God would be cheating. I just thought that that's very insightful, and it's insightful not just about how one should play sports, but it's insightful about God as well, because God wants this world to be our world, and in so doing, God allows a lot of things to happen that we really wish wouldn't happen. It becomes our responsibility.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Let me just sort of back away, because I don't want to sort of drift into ethics. So I want to keep this talking about time, and we could probably talk for 24 hours straight on all the implications of the things you said. But
absolutely,
I want to get back to the initial idea that begins the Old Testament, that of formlessness and the void. And one of the things that I've talked to many scientists about, you're my 150-something interview, so I've had lots of variations on this discussion before, and that is the idea that human beings as a species, we have a hard time dealing with abstract concepts. We evolved with these wonderfully opposed digits, and we hold things, and we can hold a nut, or we can hold a spear, or we can hold things, and it gives us that solidity, though, that apparent solidity gives us a sense of comfort. And when it comes to abstract ideas like, say, deep time, that the world didn't begin in 4004 BC, as I think Bishop Ussher or someone may have, or whoever may have come up with that.
It was Bishop Ussher. It was in a frontispiece to the King James Bible.
Yeah. And but we have difficulty with things like deep time, and I think one of the things that we have real difficulty with is even just notionally dealing with nothingness. Because when we think of nothingness, science now tells us that space, that nothingness, that there's still latent energy there. When we think of nothingness, we think of blackness, but blackness isn't nothing, it's blackness. Nothingness is absolute nothing, and it's almost inconceivable for me or you probably, or any sentient human being, to actually try to envision nothingness. Having said that, though, if if there is nothingness, and if there was nothingness, and if the universe did begin, whether in a Big Bang scientifically or at God's behest or will, I'm wondering then, time then has to be related intimately to somethingness. Because with nothingness, there can be no time. I would think, as you seem to imply earlier. So, with somethingness comes time. Is that the correct way to look at it? That God made something, and therefore time had to be. It's
Well,
contingent.
look, if time is relative, that argument becomes a no-brainer, right? If if uh, if time is absolute, then we go back to the drawing board. But the evidence right now, because of Einstein, is that time is relative, and the Newtonian time is a kind of special case where you're dealing with middle-sized objects and middle-sized speeds, velocities, and accelerations. Well, the the uh, the idea that nothingness is inconceivable is true, of course. That doesn't mean that there never was no nothingness, if you will. Pardon my grammar. It might be a limitation of the way we think, but that was the notion that nothingness is inconceivable was the notion that Parmenides used at the very start of trying to derive metaphysics from logic and cosmology from metaphysics. If nothingness is inconceivable, then there can't be nothingness. That's kind of a weak argument, as I say, because it depends on what the parameters of human thinking are, whether we can draw conclusions about what's out there from the limitations of our thinking. That's a risky proposition, as you know. There might be things that are quite inconceivable that including time running backwards, for example, that are just our conceptual apparatus isn't up to it. I've already suggested that God's thinking doesn't work the same way ours does, and part of what we have to say if we say something like that is whatever that means, because we don't know what it would mean for a being to live and think in a non-temporal way. That's so foreign to us that we can't do anything about it. Now that argument of Parmenides that time is unthinkable, that nothingness is unthinkable, and therefore there never was a beginning, is something that Aristotle picked up on. That's one of the main reasons why Aristotle thought that the universe was eternal. There couldn't have been a non-existence before existence. We got to watch out for that, because Aristotle also thought that the universe was finite in size, because of the same reason, because there can't be a void, and if you get to the end of the world, there's no there anymore. And he thought that was inconceivable too, that infinite magnitude was inconceivable, contradictory. Sometimes we run the risk of projecting our assumptions about what's real into unwarranted conclusions. Now we know that there's a logical contradiction in saying that unreality is real, but maybe that's just a quirk of the verbal nature of the way we speak, because we always speak about things. So if we speak about nothingness, we speak about it as though it were a thing, and it's not a thing. Of course, it's just the opposite of a thing, as the word "no thing" implies. I think one should be very cautious about drawing implications about the inconceivability of nothingness.
Yeah.
Does that help at all? I don't know.
I want to talk and ask a question about a scientific notion, and also the relation between the idea of the soul and time.
Yeah.
There's a phrase called the eternal present that is sort of a notion that all beings live in the eternal present. But in some science fiction works and also some philosophical stuff that I've read, that there's the notion that, like in the Jimmy Stewart movie, uh, uh, the Capra one, what's It's a Wonderful Life, that
Yes.
souls somehow are outside of time, waiting for an experience or a person to ensoul themselves within, i.e., that it's been phrased sort of as that life is not like a roller coaster in that we are riding upon it, but that we beings are different roller coasters that souls can ride, i.e., the Lenn Goodman roller coaster is something that numerous souls can traverse to somehow experience something. But of course, Lenn Goodman, as we know, is enmeshed in time from whatever year you were born to whatever year you ended. So if I'm a soul living out there in the ether with God, looking for an experience, maybe, I don't know, maybe you had a son that died in war, or you had a certain illness, or your mother died in a certain way, or your parents divorced, and these things could help ameliorate the soul, which is like God, somehow out of time. Have you ever thought about that kind of approach to existence and time, i.e., that you may be fixed in what science calls the block universe, from point A to point B, sort of like a space-time snake, and that multiple souls could maybe experience your life in that sense, so that what you think is you, Lenn Goodman, or me, Dan Schneider, or someone else themselves, is really just an experience that a soul that lives outside of time with God in that higher plane, or whatever it might be, is meant to experience to ameliorate themselves.
That's an interesting idea, but I think it belongs more in science fiction,
Yeah.
and science fiction is today's mythology. And one of the things we have to know about myths, if we understand myths as tales that are told in response to needs and values, and meant to affirm something profound, the needs and values and affirmations that stories of that kind make, I think, are about a sense of wanting to transcend time, which is ultimately a kind of wish to be gods. I'm rather suspicious of human attempts to be gods. I have written a book called Coming to Mind, The Soul in Its Body, which does deal with the relationship of the body and the soul, and I do affirm that there is a soul, but I don't think that a soul should be thought of as some kind of timeless entity waiting for a ride. I think that human souls are distinctively temporal, and one of the things we know from the examination of our unconsciousness is that it's always looking to the past and looking to the future and constituting a present for itself. That idea of temporality is developed in interesting ways by William James and by Henri Bergson. James was both a psychologist and a physician and a philosopher, and he and Bergson picked up on an idea that was beginning to be talked about in their time, an idea of what they called the specious present. And the reason they got that idea, the reason they found that idea attractive, was that if you look at time as a kind of pure continuum, which is infinitely divisible, the present seems to disappear because the past is already gone and the future is not yet, and the present looks like it's a razor edge that's infinitely thin. And that seems to mean that there is no time, and that's an idea that St. Augustine played with in his Confessions, in the last three books of the Confessions. But it also poses a threat to to human action, because there's no time in which a human being could act. Everything is either over and done with, or in the future, waiting to be determined by all kinds of external causes. And moral philosophers in general, I guess, many of them want to be able to say that there's a span of time in which we can act. So Bergson had the idea that our psychological present is not this infinitely thin razor edge. It's more like a boat, which has a prow and a stern, and we're operating inside the boat, and to some extent, given the winds and the currents, to some extent, steering the boat. And they called that notion the specious present, and the argument for it, as the word specious doesn't mean false, it means apparent. The argument for it was based on the subjective nature of appearance, that's the way we experience time. We experience time as a moment. Bergson was very interested in music, and if you think about the way you experience music, you'll see the roots of his idea, because when we listen to music, we're not just hearing the present instantaneous moment. We're also remembering what we just heard and anticipating what we're about to hear, and we pull together that experience into a unity. Immanuel Kant had a name for that. He called it the transcendental unity of apperception. It's a mouthful, but it just means pulling together the moments of our experience into some kind of a momentary whole. And there were psychologists who went about trying to measure how long the specious present lasts. And they would say, oh, it lasts 6 seconds or something like that, which is silly, because the time that we experience as the present, like the place that we experience as the place where we are, can be described in larger or smaller terms. I can say I'm in my office, I can say I'm at Vanderbilt, I can say I'm in Nashville, I can say I'm in the U.S., depending on the frame of reference that I want to use. And similarly with time, I can say that we're participating in a conversation here. I can say that this is such and such a day, or such and such a month, or such and such a year, or such and such a lifetime. There are, if you get rid of the subjectivity of the notion of the specious present, what you get is the time that it takes for an event to transpire, for an experience to be had as an experience, for something to be done. So an example that I used in a couple of places that I've written about, I used the example of building a cathedral, which can take multiple generations, or the collaboration across the generations of Edward Fitzgerald with Omar Khayyam in the making a unified poem out of the Rubaiyat that were attributed to Omar Khayyam, little quatrains that were originally separate. So the present then becomes a larger or smaller duration relative to the processes and indeed the activities that we invest in it. So I think that's a better way of thinking of time. But coming back to your point, I think Kant proved that all our experience is temporal. So the idea of a soul sort of standing or sitting outside of time and sort of finding its moment to get instantiated and realized, I think that's a fantasy. One of the reasons John Locke talked about the importance back in the 17th century, talked about the importance of memory in establishing identity. Souls, if they're anything at all, are identities, and memory is a critical factor in that. So Leibniz, great German philosopher who was a predecessor of Locke, said that it wouldn't matter to him if he could become the emperor of China if he lost his memory. If he didn't know who he was, what would be the point? That I think establishes the importance of memory as a way of unifying the self over time. And in that book, coming to mind, I talk a lot. There's a whole chapter. My co-author, Greg Cosmoetica, and I talk a lot about memory in this regard.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. It's interesting when you were talking. I was just thinking about Zeno's paradox of motion, that you'd have to go halfway and then a quarter of the way and then an eighth of the way. But it's not really a paradox in the real world. And some things are just sort of out there in the mind and whatnot. And certainly memory is an interesting aspect to bring in it. Let me end this segment. In the next segment, I want to just sort of wrap things up, talk a little bit about what you have going on in the future, and then ask one or two more questions. And we'll do that in a moment. I've just spent about an hour talking with philosopher Lenn Goodman about God and time. I will link to his webpage below this video, his webpage at Vanderbilt University. Let me just ask two things. One, what are you working on in the near future in terms of a book and whatnot? And secondly, to end the show, to what degree is your belief in God and time determined by what science reveals? So let me just ask about your personal future and then just end with the philosophical one.
Lovely. Okay, well, I'm working on a couple of projects at once. We said at the beginning you can't do two things at once, but if you give time a little more space, you sort of do. And my wife worries that maybe I say yes too often. I've got a book coming out very shortly this month, which is called Judaism, a contemporary philosophical investigation. Many of the questions that we touched on and many others are dealt with in that book, to be published this month by Routledge. I've got another book in the pipeline, which is called The Holy One of Israel. It's, again, a contribution to Jewish philosophy. I've been writing essays on Islamic philosophy as well. I've got a paper coming out about the great Muslim historian of the 14th century, Ibn Khaldun, and I recently published a big article about Razi, who was, by the way, a great physician of the 10th century and lived near Tehran, but died about 935. Razi, great physician, very original and independent-minded philosopher, and he, in fact, was a time absolutist, which was very rare in the Middle Ages. He thought that time had an objective reality, independent of God. The big project I'm working on, Dan, is along with a colleague, Phil Lieberman, we're translating Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed from the original Arabic. That should be finished around this time next year. It'll be out from Stanford University Press a little more than a year from now. Maimonides, regarded as the greatest of the Jewish philosophers, certainly of the Middle Ages, probably one of the greatest Jewish thinkers of all time, a great jurist, a great physician, and a really interesting and original philosopher with a big impact on Thomas Aquinas, and not only on Jewish philosophy, but on Christian and Muslim philosophy as well. His work, The Guide to the Perplexed, originally written in Arabic, this will be a new translation with commentary, very faithful to the original and speaking in the language that today's reader can understand. That'll be published by Stanford University Press a little over a year from now. So that gives you some idea. If you want to know a little bit more, in just a few days, I'll be off to Israel to speak at a conference on Bible and philosophy. I've written a lot about philosophy in the Bible and how the philosophy of the Bible works, and I'll be heading to England immediately after that conference in Jerusalem, where I'll be keynoting a conference. Those of you who are watching in England, I'll be keynoting a conference at Oxford, at Oriel College, Oxford, sponsored by the Jubilee Center for Virtue and Character. And the conference is on virtue ethics. It's about the relationship of intellectual virtues to moral virtues virtues, and I'll be talking about Jewish and Islamic philosophers who worked on the topic of that issue of how the intellectual virtues contribute to and are contributed to by the moral virtues. That's in early January at Oxford University. If you check the website of the Jubilee Center at Birmingham University, you'll see all the details about that conference.
And so, the final thing is, how tied is your perception of God and belief in time and the divine tied to say scientific discoveries? And could there be something that would upset the apple cart of your beliefs?
I think one has to answer yes to that. Certainly, if one think of God as the being that's most important, one constitutes one's idea of God around one's most firmly held values, and in that sense, upsetting the apple cart is going to be a little difficult to do if you have a thoughtful idea about what you understand by God. However, I think one needs to be open to everything that the sciences have to say. There's a book of mine I'll mention. It's called In Defense of Truth, and the big thesis of that book is that when we're talking about truth, whether in religion or in morals or in science or in art or in mythology, these things all have to connect. They all have to be responsible to one another and responsive to one another. So I think intellectual honesty requires one not to compartmentalize, to be very open-minded. Your viewers and listeners could get an idea of that from what I said about Darwin. Look at Darwin carefully, and you'll see that what he says is not incompatible with religion, but popularly it's thought to be so, and opportunists have pressed that notion. But if you keep an open mind, I think you have an obligation not only to be open to what the sciences are telling us, but also to think critically. It's easy to say, reason and revelation have a historic sibling rivalry, let's call it. And I think that that's true, but one's obligation, if one really wants to be open-minded, is not just to assume that what one imagines is the dictate of reason and what one imagines is the dictate of revelation are as one initially took them to be. When one interprets them in terms of one another, you can reach thoughtful and creative results. I've referred to that a couple times in different things that I've written as chimneying, using that image derived from what rock climbers do. They get in between two rock faces and they push off from one side and the other and gradually work their way up. Reason and revelation, faith and reason, call it what you like, religion and science, ethics and religion, work together that way. One can use the one to inform the other. One uses one's ethical ideas to inform one's idea of God, and vice versa. One has to use what one knows about God to inform one's ethical ideas. Open-mindedness goes together with humility, and synthetic thinking is what we really need to try and put them together, bring them into a harmonious and fruitful, creative interaction.
Well, Lenn, thank you for your time, and it was a pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you, Dan. I look forward to seeing that podcast.
Okay. Well, thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.